The chandelier light didn't just shine that night. It exposed everything no one was supposed to see. Crystal reflections scattered across the ballroom like fractured stars, catching on polished shoes, diamond necklaces, and the glossy black surface of cameras raised just a little too eagerly, as if everyone in the room was waiting for something to break. Ethan Caldwell stood at the center of it all, tall, composed, his tailored tuxedo fitting him like authority itself, his presence bending the energy of the room without effort. Conversations softened when he lifted his glass, laughter sharpened when he spoke, and every guest, investors, socialites, media personalities, watched him the way people watch a man who has never been told no. Beside him stood Amara Brooks, his wife, her deep bronze skin glowing under the chandelier's soft gold light, her posture straight, her expression calm in a way that didn't invite questions. She wore a sleek midnight blue gown that didn't scream for attention but held it anyway, the kind of quiet elegance that didn't need validation. And yet, even in that room filled with wealth and spectacle, there was a distance around her, invisible but undeniable, like she existed just half a step outside the world Ethan controlled. The orchestra played low, a smooth jazz arrangement that hummed beneath the surface, but it was the subtle shift in Ethan's voice that pulled attention tighter than any melody. "You know," he said, swirling the amber liquid in his glass, his tone casual, almost amused. "I always believed presentation was everything." A few guests leaned in, smiles already forming, anticipating charm. It's funny how some people forget that. A ripple of polite laughter moved through the group, uncertain at first, then growing as they looked for cues from him. Ethan's eyes slid toward Amara, not with warmth, but with a sharp, assessing edge. "I mean, you can dress something up," he continued, his voice smooth, controlled. "But that doesn't change where it came from." This time the laughter came quicker, louder, sharper. Not everyone laughed, but enough did. Enough to make the air feel thinner. Cameras tilted slightly. Phones lifted. Someone in the back whispered his name, already sensing a moment worth capturing. Amara didn't move. Not immediately. Her fingers tightened just slightly around the clutch in her hand, a small movement, almost invisible, but deliberate. Her breathing stayed steady. Her chin didn't drop. She didn't look away. She simply stood there, letting the words land without giving them the reaction the room expected. Ethan glanced at her, waiting, just a second longer than necessary, as if anticipating a response, a flinch, something he could define. But she gave him nothing. And somehow, that made the silence heavier than the laughter that came before it. A woman near the bar cleared her throat, shifting uncomfortably. A man adjusted his cufflinks, eyes darting between them. The orchestra faltered for half a beat before recovering. Ethan smirked slightly, lifting his glass again as if sealing the moment, as if it had gone exactly the way he intended. "No offense, of course," he added, though the words carried no apology. Another round of laughter, softer this time, less certain. The kind of laughter people give when they don't want to be on the wrong side of power. Amara finally moved, but not in defense. She turned her head just slightly, her gaze drifting across the room, not searching for support, not seeking sympathy, but observing. The flashes of cameras, the tilt of curious faces, the quiet calculation in people's eyes as they decided what this moment meant and how they would remember it. Her expression didn't crack. If anything, it became stiller, like a surface of water untouched by the storm beneath. There was a story behind that stillness, one the room didn't know. Late nights alone in a penthouse that never felt like home. Conversations that ended before they began. The slow realization that respect, once withheld, rarely arrives on its own. She had learned to exist without asking for space. Learned to carry herself without permission. Learned that silence, when chosen, could be louder than anything said out loud. A server passed by with a tray of champagne flutes, the delicate clink of glass barely cutting through the tension. Someone near the entrance turned, their head distracted for a second. Then another, a subtle shift, like the room itself had exhaled and drawn attention towards something unseen. The doors at the far end of the ballroom opened. Not dramatically, not with force, just enough for a thin line of cooler air to slip inside, brushing against the warmth of the crowd. At first, no one reacted. The music continued. Conversations resumed in low murmurs. But then the figure stepped through. A woman, composed, unfamiliar to most in the room, her presence quiet but grounded. And beside her, small, steady, completely out of place in a room built on curated perfection, was a little girl. She couldn't have been more than 4 years old. Her dress was simple, soft cream fabric that moved gently as she walked, her shoes making the faintest sound against the marble floor. She held the woman's hand at first, then let go, her small steps carrying her forward with a kind of unshaken curiosity that only children possess. The light caught her curls, framing her face in soft shadows and gold. Conversations didn't stop all at once. They faded, one voice at a time, one laugh cut short, one whispered question. Phones lowered, then lifted again, but this time not for Ethan. The shift was subtle, but absolute. Attention moved. It settled. It locked. Ethan didn't notice at first. He was still mid-conversation, still holding the center of his world together with practiced ease. But then the silence reached him. Not empty silence, focused silence. The kind that carries weight. His brow tightened slightly. His head turned. And that's when he saw her. Not Amara. Not the crowd. The little girl. For a moment, nothing happened. The room didn't spin. The music didn't stop. No one spoke. But something inside Ethan did. His expression didn't collapse. It stalled. Like a system trying to process something it wasn't built to understand. His eyes fixed on the child's face. And then, almost involuntarily, narrowed. Because it wasn't just familiarity. It wasn't resemblance in a vague, dismissible way. It was precision. The shape of her eyes. The exact shade. The way they held light. Sharp, reflective, unmistakable. It was like looking at a memory he didn't know he had, mirrored back at him in a smaller, living form. His grip on the glass tightened just slightly. Not enough for anyone to comment. But enough. The girl paused a few feet into the room, her gaze drifting, curious, unafraid. She didn't understand the shift she had caused. She didn't need to. Because the truth didn't belong to her understanding. It belonged to the man who couldn't look away. Amara saw it too. Not the first glance. She had seen that coming long before tonight. But the second one. The one where recognition begins to settle. Her expression didn't change. But something deeper, quieter, resolved. The room held its breath. And for the first time that night, Ethan Caldwell wasn't the one controlling what came next. The silence did not break all at once. It tightened first, like a wire being pulled slowly through the room, drawing every eye, every breath, toward the same point without anyone daring to name it. And Ethan felt it before he understood it. A subtle shift in the way people stopped listening to him and started looking past him, through him, as if something more important had just entered the frame. Something that did not ask for permission to exist in his world. And when he finally took a step forward, not toward the girl but simply to regain ground that felt like it was slipping beneath him, the polished marble floor seemed colder, harder, less certain than it had moments ago. His voice, when he tried to speak again, did not carry the same effortless authority. It landed shorter, flatter, as if the room had quietly withdrawn its agreement with him. And that was when the woman who had entered with the child stopped near the edge of the crowd, her posture calm, her presence deliberate. And without raising her voice, without demanding attention, she said a single sentence that did not echo but settled, heavy and undeniable. We are not here to interrupt, only to return what belongs where it was left. And the words did not sound like an accusation. They sounded like a correction, a quiet adjustment to a narrative that had been running too long without challenge, and Ethan's jaw tightened, his gaze flicking from the woman to the child again, searching for something that would allow him to dismiss what he was seeing, something small, something imperfect, something that would let him place distance between himself and that face. But the longer he looked, the more precise the resemblance became, not exaggerated, not imagined, but exact in the ways that mattered, the curve of the brow, the intensity behind the eyes, the way the child observed the room not with fear, but with a calm awareness that felt far older than her. Years, and around them. The room adjusted. Conversations stopped pretending to continue. People shifted positions to get a clearer view. Phones rose again, but this time with purpose, capturing not a spectacle engineered by wealth, but a moment that could not be controlled. And Amara remained where she was, her body still, her gaze steady. But something within her had changed, not outwardly, not in a way that invited attention, but in the way her shoulders no longer carried the same invisible weight, as if something long held in silence had finally arrived at the edge of being seen. And Ethan noticed that too. Though he could not yet name it, he only felt the loss of something he had always assumed would remain his: control, narrative, certainty. And he stepped closer, just one measured step, his voice lower now, stripped of performance. "I think you have the wrong event," he said. But even as the words left his mouth, they lacked conviction, because the truth was already pressing against him from too many angles to ignore. The woman met his gaze without hesitation. "No," she said simply. "We came to the right place." And the girl, who had been quietly observing, took another small step forward, her eyes finding Ethan's again, not searching, not questioning, just holding. And something in that unbroken gaze unsettled him more than any accusation could have, because there was no demand in it, no expectation, only presence. And that made it harder to reject, harder to push away, harder to reduce to something insignificant. And behind him, a murmur spread, low but growing, fragments of speculation, recognition, disbelief, each voice adding to the pressure building in the room. And Ethan's mind moved quickly, faster than his expression allowed, running through timelines, decisions, moments he had categorized and filed away as irrelevant, resolved, finished. But memory does not always stay where it is placed, and now pieces began to shift, to connect in ways he had not anticipated. A conversation he ended too quickly, a departure he justified too easily, a silence he chose because it was convenient. And the weight of those choices, once distant, began to draw closer, heavier, more defined. And he turned his head slightly toward Amara, expecting something, anything, a reaction, an explanation, a denial. But she did not offer him that. She did not move toward him or away. She simply watched, and in that stillness was something new, something he had never fully recognized before. Not distance, not resignation, but authority, quiet and complete. And for the first time that night, Ethan understood that whatever was happening did not belong to him to direct. And the realization did not come with panic. It came with a slow, tightening awareness that the structure he had relied on, the unspoken agreement that he would always be the one defining the moment, was no longer holding. And the woman shifted her attention to Amara. A brief glance, a silent acknowledgement, and Amara responded with the smallest nod, barely noticeable, but enough to confirm what the room had not yet fully processed, that this was not an interruption, not an accident, but an arrival, intentional and precise. And the girl turned slightly, looking up at Amara for just a second. And in that brief exchange, something passed between them, something familiar, something grounded, something that did not need explanation. And when the child looked back at Ethan, the room seemed to narrow again, every detail sharpening, every sound pulling back, until it was just that line of sight, unbroken and unavoidable. And Ethan exhaled slowly, though he had not realized he had been holding his breath. And when he spoke again, it was not to the room, not to protect his image, but to the question that had already formed, unavoidable and clear. "What is this?" he asked, and the woman did not rush to answer. She let the silence hold for a second longer, long enough for the weight of the moment to settle fully. Then she said, "This is the part you chose not to see." And the words did not accuse, they revealed, and the effect was immediate, the murmur rising again, louder now, more certain, as people began to understand the shape of what was unfolding. Not all the details, not yet, but enough to recognize the shift, enough to feel the balance of power tilt in a way that could not be undone. And Ethan felt it, not as a dramatic collapse, but as a gradual loss of ground, step by step, assumption by assumption, until the certainty he had walked into the room with no longer had a place to stand. And he looked again at the child, at the unmistakable reflection staring back at him. And this time he did not search for differences, because there were none that mattered. And somewhere in the room, a camera flashed, then another, capturing the exact moment the realization settled into his expression, not exaggerated, not loud, but undeniable. And Amara watched it all without interruption, her silence no longer passive, but chosen, her presence no longer secondary, but central. And as the room leaned into the truth unfolding before them, One thing became clear in a way that could not be reversed. This was no longer his stage, and whatever came next would not be something he could control. The room did not return to normal. It reshaped itself around the truth that had just been placed at its center, and every second that passed without resolution made the tension more visible, more defined, like a fracture spreading through glass that no one could pretend was not there anymore. And Ethan felt it in the way no one spoke to him first, in the way no one laughed to fill the silence, in the way even the music seemed distant now, reduced to a faint echo behind the weight of what stood in front of him. And the little girl did not move away. She did not hide behind the woman who brought her. She simply stood there with a quiet steadiness that made the moment feel less like an interruption and more like something inevitable finally taking shape. And Ethan lowered his glass slowly, placing it onto a passing tray without looking, his focus locked entirely on the child, on the impossible familiarity that was no longer possible to dismiss. And when he spoke again, his voice had changed, not louder, not weaker, but stripped of performance. "What is her name?" he asked, and it was not a demand. It was not even a question meant for the room. It was something more personal, more direct. And the woman answered without hesitation, "Her name is Lila." And the name landed softly. But it carried weight, because now the child was no longer an abstract possibility, no longer just a resemblance. She was someone defined, someone real, and Lila tilted her head slightly, studying him in return, her eyes holding his with the same quiet intensity. And Ethan felt something shift deeper, something he could not immediately control, not emotion in the way he understood it, but recognition in its earliest form, raw and unfiltered. And behind him, the murmurs grew more specific, fragments of conversation sharpening into theories, into connections, into conclusions that did not wait for confirmation. And someone whispered his name again, not with admiration this time, but with curiosity edged in disbelief. And Ethan turned slightly toward Amara again, his expression searching, because now the question was no longer abstract. Now it had direction, now it pointed somewhere. And Amara met his gaze fully for the first time since the moment began, her eyes steady, her posture unchanged. But there was something undeniable in the way she held that silence, not as avoidance, but as control. And when she finally spoke, her voice was calm, measured, untouched by the chaos surrounding them. "You already know the answer," she said, and she did not raise her voice, did not emphasize the words, but they carried across the room with more force than anything shouted could have. And Ethan's jaw tightened again, not in denial, but in the effort to process what had already settled in his mind before he was ready to accept it. And the memory came not as a single moment, but as fragments aligning, a night he had dismissed, a conversation he had cut short, a departure he had justified as necessary, efficient, final, and he had believed it was final. He had built his certainty on that belief, and now that certainty was being quietly dismantled piece by piece, not with accusation, not with confrontation, but with presence, undeniable and complete. And Lila took another small step forward, closing the distance just enough that the resemblance became impossible to ignore from any angle. The light catching her eyes in a way that mirrored his exactly, and the room reacted again, a collective shift, a quiet agreement forming among those watching, not spoken but understood. And Ethan exhaled again, slower this time, as if trying to steady something inside him that no longer followed his command. And he looked at the woman who had brought Lila, his voice quieter now. "Why now?" he asked, and the question carried more than timing. It carried confusion. It carried the unspoken expectation that if something like this existed, it should have remained unseen. And the woman answered with the same calm precision she had held since entering. "Because silence has a limit," she said, and the words did not accuse him directly, but they did not need to, because the implication settled where it belonged. And Ethan's gaze shifted back to Amara again, and this time he did not look for confirmation. He looked for understanding, for context, for something that would explain how this moment had been built without his awareness. And Amara did not step closer, did not reach for Lila, did not perform anything for the room. She simply spoke again. "I waited for you to choose differently," she said, her voice even, steady, without bitterness. "And when you did not, I chose for myself." And the simplicity of the statement carried more weight than any accusation could have, because it reframed everything, not as something done to him, but as something he had failed to do. And the room absorbed that shift immediately, the narrative adjusting again, and Ethan felt it in the way people no longer looked at him as the center, but as part of the story unfolding. And for the first time that night, he did not try to redirect it. He did not interrupt, because something deeper had already taken hold, something that demanded his attention more than the room ever had. And he looked down at Lila again, really looked this time, not searching for confirmation, but acknowledging what was already there. And his voice, when it came again, was quieter than before, almost careful. "How long?" he asked, and Amara answered without hesitation. "For years," and the number settled into the space between them. Precise and undeniable, and Ethan's expression shifted, not dramatically, not visibly to everyone, but enough for those closest to see the weight of it, the recalculation, the realization of time lost, moments missed, decisions that could not be reversed. And the room held that moment with them, no longer just observers, but witnesses. And somewhere in the background, another camera flashed, capturing not a spectacle, but a turning point, and Lila remained steady, her small presence anchoring the entire scene, not demanding anything, not asking for anything, simply existing in a way that made everything else adjust around her. And Amara watched Ethan, not with expectation, not with hope, but with clarity, because whatever came next would not be something she waited for anymore. It would be something he had to face on his own. And as the silence stretched again, heavier now but clearer, one truth settled fully into the room. This was no longer about revelation, it was about consequence. And Ethan, for the first time, understood that he was no longer deciding what happened next. He was only beginning to understand what had already happened. The number did not fade. It stayed suspended in the air like a timestamp no one could rewind, for years settling into the silence with a weight that bent every assumption Ethan had carried into that room. And for a moment he did not move, did not speak, because movement would have meant reaction and reaction would have meant acknowledgement. And he was still standing at the edge of that realization, feeling it solidify beneath him whether he accepted it or not. And around him the room had fully shifted now, no longer a place of celebration but a space of observation. Every guest quietly recalibrating their understanding of the man they had admired just minutes before, and Ethan felt that shift not in their words but in their restraint, in the absence of the easy approval he was used to, in the subtle distance that had formed without anyone needing to step back physically. And his gaze lowered again to Lila, and this time he noticed the smaller details, the way her fingers curled slightly at her sides, the way her shoulders stayed relaxed despite the attention surrounding her, the way she did not cling to anyone for reassurance. And it struck him that her steadiness did not come from the room. It came from somewhere else, somewhere she had been taught to stand without needing validation. And his chest tightened, not sharply, not dramatically, but enough to interrupt the rhythm he had controlled all evening. And he lifted his eyes to Amara again, and this time there was no distance in his gaze, only a directness he had not allowed himself before. "You should have told me," he said, and the words came out slower than intended, less certain, because even as he said them, something within him questioned their truth, and Amara did not react immediately. She let the statement exist for what it was, an attempt to reposition responsibility, and when she answered, her voice remained calm, but it carried a clarity that cut through the room without force. "You should have stayed long enough to hear it," she said, and the sentence did not rise in volume, but it shifted everything, because it did not argue. It corrected, and the memory that followed did not arrive as a full scene. It came in fragments. The last conversation he had ended abruptly, the message he had chosen not to return, the decision he had framed as necessary for his future, efficient, clean, justified. And he had told himself it was the right move, that it was strategic, that it removed complication. And now that version of the story felt incomplete, not because it was false, but because it was missing what he had refused to see at the time. And the weight of that omission pressed forward now, undeniable, and Ethan's jaw shifted slightly, his posture adjusting as if to regain some form of control, but the movement did not restore what had already been lost. And Lila looked between them, her gaze moving from Amara to Ethan with quiet curiosity, not confusion, not fear, just awareness. And Ethan noticed that too, the absence of fear, the absence of hesitation, and it unsettled him in a way he could not immediately explain, because it meant she had not been raised in uncertainty. She had been raised in something steady, something intentional, something he had not been part of, and the realization did not come with anger. It came with something heavier, something slower, and he took a breath, deeper this time, as if trying to align himself with a moment that refused to follow his pace. And the woman who had brought Lila stepped slightly to the side, not withdrawing, but allowing space, allowing the moment to belong where it needed to, and Ethan's voice lowered again, quieter now, stripped of the edge it had carried earlier in the night. "Why bring her here?" he asked, and this time the question was not defensive, it was searching, and Amara held his gaze, not with confrontation, not with challenge, but with certainty. "Because you made this place where truth should be seen," she said, her tone even. "You made everything public, remember?" And the words did not accuse him directly, but they placed the moment exactly where it belonged, within the world he had built, the world where appearances mattered, where perception shaped reality, where moments like this defined narratives, and now that same structure was holding something he could not control, and the room responded to that understanding. The murmurs shifting again, quieter now but more focused, as if everyone present recognized the symmetry of it, the irony of it, the way the setting itself had become part of the revelation. And Ethan exhaled slowly, his shoulders lowering just slightly, not in defeat, but in recognition, because there was no immediate response that could undo what had been set in motion, and he looked at Lila again. And this time his expression changed in a way that was not for the room, not for perception, but for himself, a small shift, almost imperceptible, where resistance gave way to acknowledgement, and he crouched slightly, not fully lowering himself, but enough to bring his gaze closer to her level. And the movement alone sent a ripple through the room, because it was the first time he had adjusted himself to someone else's position instead of expecting them to rise to his. And Lila watched him without stepping back, her eyes steady, her expression calm, and for a moment, the noise of the room faded again, not completely, but enough that the space between them felt separate from everything else. And Ethan spoke again, his voice softer now, careful. "Hi, Lila," he said, and the name sounded different this time, not distant, not abstract, but grounded, and Lila blinked once, considering him, then answered simply, "Hi." And the exchange was small, almost ordinary, but within it was something that shifted the entire weight of the moment, because it was the first interaction not defined by tension, not shaped by the room, but existing on its own, and Ethan held that moment for a second. Longer, as if trying to understand it fully, as if trying to place himself within it in a way he had not prepared for. And when he stood back up, the room returned in full, the attention, the cameras, the silence that was no longer uncertain but expectant, and Amara watched him, not waiting, not hoping, just observing, because whatever came next would not change what had already been revealed. And Ethan turned slightly, his gaze sweeping across the room, taking in the faces, the expressions, the subtle shifts in perception that had already begun to redefine him in their eyes. And for the first time that night, he did not try to control that narrative. He did not attempt to redirect it, because he understood now that it no longer belonged entirely to him. And as the silence settled again, deeper this time but clearer, one truth stood fully formed in the center of the room, not loud, not dramatic, but absolute. This was no longer about what had been hidden, it was about what would be faced, and Ethan, standing between the world he had built and the reality he had avoided, knew that whatever came next would not be decided by power, but by what he chose to do with the truth now standing in front of him. The room did not rush forward after that small exchange. It lingered, suspended between what had already been revealed and what no one yet knew how to address. And Ethan felt that pause more sharply than anything spoken, because it removed the urgency he usually relied on, the pace that allowed him to direct outcomes before they could settle, and now everything was slowing around him, forcing him to stand inside the moment instead of moving past it. And as he straightened fully, his gaze moved once more to Amara. But this time there was no edge, No expectation of reaction, only a quiet recognition that whatever distance had existed between them before was no longer defined by silence but by choice. And that distinction changed everything. And the weight of that realization pressed deeper when he noticed something else, something subtle but undeniable. Amara was not waiting for him, not for his explanation, not for his apology, not even for his acknowledgement. She was simply present, grounded in a decision she had already made long before stepping into this room. And that presence carried a kind of finality that no argument could shift, and Ethan's fingers flexed slightly at his sides, a small, unconscious movement that revealed the tension he no longer concealed with ease. And he glanced briefly at the crowd, at the faces that had once mirrored his confidence, but now reflected something else: curiosity, judgment, recalculation, and he understood in that instant that the narrative had already begun to move without him, shaped by what had been seen rather than what he could say. And the awareness did not spark panic. It created a deeper pressure, a need to respond not for the room but for himself. And he turned back to Amara, his voice quieter now, more deliberate. "You made a decision without me," he said, and the words were not accusatory, but they carried the weight of something unfinished. And Amara held his gaze without flinching, without softening. "I made a decision after you made yours," she replied, her tone steady, her posture unchanged, and the clarity of that response settled between them with precision, removing any space for reinterpretation. And Ethan inhaled slowly, the air feeling heavier than before, as if each breath required acknowledgement of something he had avoided for too long. And his eyes shifted again to Lila, who now stood just slightly closer to Amara, her small hand brushing lightly against the fabric of her gown, not seeking protection but maintaining connection. And Ethan noticed that too, the quiet bond, the unspoken understanding that did not need demonstration, and something inside him tightened. Further, not sharply, but with a steady pull that refused to be ignored, and he stepped back half a pace, not retreating, but creating space, as if the physical distance might help him process what the moment demanded. And the woman who had accompanied Lila remained silent, her presence still, observant, allowing the exchange to unfold without interruption. And the room mirrored that stillness, every guest now fully invested, not in spectacle, but in outcome, in the shift of power that had already begun to redefine the balance within the space. And Ethan exhaled again, slower this time, his shoulders lowering slightly as the tension in his stance eased just enough to reveal something beneath it, not defeat, but the beginning of understanding. And he spoke again, his voice carrying less force but more weight. "I did not know," he said, and this time the statement was not a defense. It was a truth he had to face. And Amara did not challenge it. She did not deny it. She simply answered with the same calm certainty that had guided her through the entire night. "You did not want to know," she said, and the difference between the two statements settled instantly, precise and undeniable. And Ethan's jaw tightened slightly, not in resistance, but in recognition, because the distinction was accurate in a way he could not refute. And the memory surfaced again, clearer now, the moments he had chosen distance, the calls he had not returned, the conversations he had cut short, in favor of control, and he had justified each one at the time, framed them as necessary, efficient, aligned with the life he intended to build. And now that framework felt incomplete, not because it was false, but because it had excluded something essential, something that now stood directly in front of him. And Lila shifted her weight slightly, her gaze still fixed on him, and for a brief second, something softer moved across her expression, not expectation, not demand, just curiosity. And it was that simplicity that unsettled him most, because it carried no judgment, no history, only presence. And Ethan lowered his gaze for a fraction of a second before lifting it again, as if recalibrating himself to meet that unfiltered reality. And when he spoke next, his voice carried a different tone entirely, quieter, more measured. "What happens now?" he asked. And the question was no longer about control. It was about consequence, about direction, about something he could not define alone. And Amara did not answer immediately. She allowed the silence to hold, not as hesitation, but as intention. And when she finally spoke, her words were simple, but they carried the full weight of her position. "That depends on you," she said, and the statement did not offer guidance, did not provide reassurance. It returned responsibility to where it belonged, and Ethan absorbed that slowly, the meaning settling deeper with each passing second, and he nodded once, almost imperceptibly, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement, and the room seemed to lean in again, waiting, watching, measuring the next move in a moment that had already shifted beyond expectation, and Ethan looked at Lila again, his gaze softer now, less guarded, and for a brief moment, the noise of the room faded once more, leaving only the quiet connection between them, fragile but real, and he understood then that whatever came next would not be decided in a single moment, not resolved in front of an audience, but built slowly, intentionally, through choices he had not yet made, and the realization did not overwhelm him, it steadied him, grounding him in a way the performance of power never had, and as he straightened again, facing both Amara and the room with a presence that was no longer defined by control but by awareness, one truth became clear in a way that could not be undone. This was not the end of the moment. It was the beginning of everything he had once chosen to leave behind, now standing in front of him, waiting not for his approval, but for his response. The question did not dissolve into the room. It settled, firm and deliberate, and for the first time that night, no one rushed to fill the silence that followed, because everyone understood that whatever answer came next would not be shaped by expectation or performance, but by choice. And Ethan stood there with that weight pressing against him, feeling the difference between a moment he could control and one he had to step into without preparation. And the distinction was unfamiliar, uncomfortable in a way that did not show on his face but tightened something deeper, something that had always been buffered by distance and certainty. And now that buffer was gone, replaced by a reality that did not adjust to him, and his gaze moved from Amara to Lila again, slower this time, more intentional, as if he was allowing himself to fully register her presence instead of resisting it. And the more he looked, the more undeniable the connection became, not just in appearance, but in something quieter, something reflective in the way she held herself, and it forced him to confront not only what had been hidden from him, but what he had chosen not to see. And the realization did not arrive all at once. It unfolded, piece by piece, each second revealing another layer of consequence that could not be reversed, and the room remained still, no longer uncertain, no longer waiting for spectacle, but watching a shift that was already complete, a reversal that did not need announcement because it was evident in every detail, in the way Ethan's posture had changed, in the way Amara stood without needing to assert anything, in the way Lila existed without asking for acknowledgement, yet receiving it from every corner of the room. And Ethan exhaled slowly, the breath leaving him with a steadiness he had not expected, and when he spoke again, his voice carried something new, not control, not defense, but acceptance beginning to form. "Then I start with the truth," he said, and the words were simple, but they carried weight because they were not directed at the room. They were directed at himself, and the shift was immediate, subtle but undeniable, because it marked the first time he was not responding to perception but to reality. And Amara watched him closely, not with anticipation, not with hope, but with clarity, measuring not the words but the intention behind them. And Ethan turned slightly, his gaze sweeping across the room once more, not searching for approval but acknowledging the presence of those who had witnessed everything. And for a moment, the version of him they had known lingered, the man who would have redirected, minimized, reframed, but that version did not move forward, and instead, he stepped into something else, something quieter, more grounded, and he spoke again, this time to the room, his voice steady, carrying without force. "For years ago, I walked away from something I did not take the time to understand," he said. And the words did not rise, they did not dramatize, they simply existed, and the effect was stronger because of it, because it did not sound like an explanation, it sounded like acknowledgement, and the room absorbed that immediately. The murmurs stilled, the attention sharpened, and Ethan did not continue right away. He allowed the statement to settle, to hold its place without rushing to justify it. And then he added, "Tonight, that truth walked back into my life." And the phrasing was deliberate, not shifting responsibility, not assigning blame, simply defining what had happened. And as the words landed, the focus of the room shifted again, not away from him, but through him, toward the meaning behind what he was saying. And Amara remained still, her expression unchanged, but there was a subtle shift in the air around her, a quiet acknowledgement that something had moved, not resolved, not repaired, but moved. And Lila looked up at Ethan again, her gaze steady, and for the first time, there was a hint of something else in her expression, not expectation, but awareness, as if she recognized that something was changing even if she did not yet understand the full weight of it. And Ethan met her gaze, holding it for a second longer than before, and then he did something that no one in the room expected, not because it was dramatic, but because it was simple. He stepped fully away from the center of attention, just a single step, but enough to shift the focus, enough to remove himself from the position he had held all evening. And the movement alone carried significance, because it was not a retreat, it was a redefinition, and the room felt it immediately. The balance adjusting once more, and Ethan turned back to Amara, his voice lower now, meant for her, not for the audience. "I cannot change what I did," he said, and the honesty in the statement was not polished, not refined, it was direct, and Amara held his gaze, not softening, not resisting, simply listening. And he continued, "But I will not ignore what is in front of me now." And the words did not promise more than he could give. They did not reach beyond the moment, but they established something essential, recognition, and that alone shifted the foundation of everything that followed. And Amara inhaled slowly, the breath steady, controlled, and when she spoke, her voice carried the same clarity that had defined her from the beginning. "Recognition is not enough," she said, and there was no sharpness in her tone, only truth. And Ethan nodded once, immediately, not in agreement, but in understanding, because he knew that already. He understood that acknowledgement was only the beginning, not the resolution, and the room held that exchange carefully, aware that what was happening was no longer about spectacle, but about something deeper, something more lasting. And Lila shifted slightly, her small hand now resting more firmly against Amara's side. And Ethan noticed that, the quiet trust, the connection that had been built without him, and instead of resisting it, he accepted it, allowing the reality to exist without trying to alter it. And that acceptance, small as it seemed, marked a change that could not be undone. And the silence that followed was no longer tense. It was steady, grounded, as if the moment had finally reached its true center. And as Ethan stood there, no longer at the top of the room but within it, facing the truth he had once avoided, one thing became clear in a way that did not need to be spoken. This was not a moment he would walk away from again, because this time, the truth had nowhere else to go but forward, and so did he. The air in the room did not relax after his words. It settled into something steadier, something that no longer chased reaction but waited for direction, and that difference changed the rhythm of everything. Because for the first time that night, the moment was no longer expanding outward, it was turning inward, focusing not on what had been revealed but on what would be done with it. And Ethan felt that shift as clearly as he had felt the earlier tension, only now it did not press against him. It grounded him, forcing him to stand fully present in a space he had once mastered by distance. And he did not move immediately, did not rush to fill the silence he had just created, because he understood now that speed would not serve him here, that this moment required something else entirely, something slower, something deliberate. And he looked again at Lila, his gaze no longer searching or questioning, but studying, learning, taking in details he had never allowed himself to notice before. The softness of her expression, the quiet strength in her posture, the way she did not shrink under attention but did not seek it either. And it struck him that everything about her presence contradicted the assumptions he had built his life on. That strength did not always announce itself. That value did not always demand recognition. And that realization carried more weight than any accusation could have. And he lowered himself again, this time fully, bringing himself down to her level. Without hesitation, the movement simple but intentional, and the room felt it immediately, not as a spectacle, but as a shift in alignment. And Ethan's voice, when he spoke, was softer than before, but clearer. "Lila," he said, and her name carried a steadiness now, not unfamiliar, not distant, but real, and she looked at him with the same calm attention she had held from the beginning, and he continued, I did not know about you. And the words were not offered as an excuse, they were placed carefully, honestly. And Lila did not respond right away, not because she did not understand, but because she was considering, and that pause, small as it was, carried a kind of quiet gravity that made the moment feel balanced in a way nothing else had that night. And finally she spoke, her voice light but clear. My mom said you were busy. And the simplicity of the statement cut deeper than anything else that had been said, because it carried no blame, no bitterness, only the version of the truth she had been given, and Ethan felt that settle into him, not as accusation, but as reflection, a version of himself seen through the eyes of someone who had never known him, and he nodded once, slowly, absorbing it without deflection, and when he stood again, he did not rush to speak. He allowed the silence to exist, not as something to escape, but as something to understand, and when his gaze lifted back to Amara, there was no attempt to regain ground, no effort to redirect, only a quiet acknowledgement of everything that had brought them to this point. And Amara held that gaze, her expression unchanged, but there was a subtle shift in her posture, not toward him, but into herself, as if the moment had reached a place she had already prepared for. And Ethan spoke again, his voice low, meant only for her. You carried this alone, he said, and it was not a question, it was recognition, and Amara's response came without hesitation. No, she said, I carried her with everything I had, and the distinction was immediate, clear, and it reshaped the narrative once more, because it did not frame her as someone abandoned. It defined her as someone who had built something complete without him, and Ethan absorbed that, the weight of it settling deeper than anything else that had been said, and he nodded again, more firmly this time, not in agreement, but in acceptance, because he understood now that what stood in front of him was not something fragile, not something waiting to be fixed. It was something whole, something that had grown without his presence and did not depend on it now. And that realization did not diminish him. It clarified his position within it, and the room remained still, no longer shifting, no longer uncertain, because the center of the moment had fully formed, and everyone present could feel it, the quiet gravity of a truth that did not need to be amplified to be understood. And Ethan turned slightly, his gaze moving once more across the room, not searching, not performing, but acknowledging the presence of those who had witnessed everything. And then he did something else that carried weight beyond its simplicity. He stepped away from the center entirely, creating space not for himself, but for Amara and Lila, and the movement, though small, redefined the structure of the room, shifting the focus completely. And for the first time that night, Amara stood not beside him, not behind him, but in front of the moment without needing to claim it, and Ethan remained where he had moved, not retreating, not leaving, but repositioning himself in a way that allowed the truth to exist without his control. And Lila looked up at Amara briefly, her small hand reaching for hers, and Amara took it naturally, the gesture effortless, practiced, grounded in years that had not been seen until now. And Ethan watched that connection, not with resistance, but with a growing understanding of what it represented, not loss, but reality. And as the silence settled once more, deeper now, more complete, one thing became clear in a way that did not need to be spoken. This moment was no longer about what had been revealed, it was about what had been proven, and in that proof, everything that had once been hidden had found its place, not in conflict, not in chaos, but in truth that could no longer be ignored. And Ethan, standing just outside the center of it all, understood that whatever came next would not be shaped by power or position, but by the choices he would make after this moment had passed. And for the first time, he did not look for a way to control that future. He prepared to earn his place within it. The room did not return to noise. It held on to that stillness as if it understood that anything louder would break the balance that had finally formed. And in that quiet, something deeper began to take shape, not in the center of the room where attention had been focused all night, but in the space just beyond it, where Ethan now stood, no longer positioned as the axis of everything, but as part of a reality that did not revolve around him anymore. And that shift, subtle as it appeared, carried a weight that was impossible to ignore, because it redefined not just the moment, but his place within it. And as he watched Amara and Lila together, their connection effortless, unforced, something built over time rather than displayed for effect. He felt the distance between what he had been and what he was beginning to understand stretch further than he had anticipated, and it was not a distance he could close with words, not in a room like this, not in a single night. And that realization did not discourage him. It clarified something he had not considered before. That presence was not claimed, it was earned, and he had not earned it yet. And across the room, the guests remained attentive, but their focus had changed, no longer waiting for spectacle, no longer anticipating a dramatic shift, but observing something quieter, something more meaningful, the slow, deliberate repositioning of power, not through force, but through truth. And Amara did not move to claim that power. She did not step forward, did not speak to the room, did not adjust her posture to match the attention now centered on her. She simply existed within it, steady and composed, her hand resting lightly in Lila's, her presence, defined not by reaction but by certainty. And that certainty carried through the room in a way no performance ever could, and Ethan saw it clearly now, not as something distant, not as something separate from him, but as something he had once been close to and chosen to walk away from. And the weight of that choice pressed against him again, not with regret alone, but with understanding, because for the first time, he saw the full shape of what that decision had created, not just for him, but for them. And he took a step forward, not toward the center, not toward control, but toward clarity, closing just enough distance to stand within the same space without disrupting it. And his voice, when he spoke again, was quiet, but steady, directed not at the room, but at Amara. "You did not come here to stay," he said. And it was not a question, it was an observation, and Amara met his gaze without hesitation, her expression calm, her voice even. "No," she said, and the simplicity of the answer carried a finality that did not need explanation, and Ethan nodded once, accepting it immediately, because he understood now that this moment was not an invitation, it was a statement, and the distinction mattered. And he glanced briefly at Lila again, then back to Amara. "Then I will not stop you," he said, and the words, though quiet, shifted something again, because they removed expectation, removed pressure, allowed the moment to remain what it was without forcing it into something else. And Amara held his gaze for a second longer, as if measuring the weight of what he had said, not for sincerity alone, but for understanding. And whatever she saw there was enough, because she gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement, and that acknowledgement was not given lightly. It was earned in that moment, through presence rather than persuasion, and Lila looked up at Amara again, her small hand tightening slightly in hers, and Amara glanced down at her with a softness that did not need to be displayed to be felt, and then she looked back at Ethan, her voice steady. "This is not something you step into overnight," she said, and there was no harshness in her tone, only truth, and Ethan nodded again, more firmly this time, because he understood that too, not just intellectually, but in the way the moment had unfolded around him, in the way every step forward required something more than intention, something more than words, and the room remained silent, every guest aware that what was happening now was not for them, not for their interpretation or reaction, but for the three people standing at the center of a truth that had reshaped everything. And Ethan exhaled slowly, his shoulders settling into a steadiness that had replaced the tension from earlier, and he spoke one more time, his voice low, measured. "Then I will take it one step at a time," he said. And the statement did not promise more than he could deliver, did not reach beyond the moment, but it established something essential, direction, and Amara did not respond immediately. She let the words settle, let them exist without affirmation or rejection, because she understood that what mattered now was not what he said, but what he would do after this night ended. And she turned slightly, her hand guiding Lila gently as they began to move toward the exit, not in haste, not in avoidance, but with the same quiet certainty that had defined her from the beginning. And the movement alone shifted the room again, because it marked the end of the moment not with resolution, but with decision, and Ethan did not follow immediately. He did not call out, did not interrupt, because he understood that this was not a departure he could stop. It was a path he would have to meet on different terms. And he watched as they moved through the room, the attention parting naturally, the guests stepping aside without needing instruction, because something about the way Amara walked, the way Lila stayed close to her, made it clear that this was not something to be questioned, not something to be challenged. And when they reached the doors, the same doors that had opened to let the truth in, they paused for just a second, and Amara turned her head slightly, not fully, just enough that her voice could carry back to him without needing to raise it. "If you are serious," she said, "you will not wait for another moment like this." And then she stepped forward, the doors opening once more, the cooler air brushing against the warmth of the room as they exited. And the space they left behind did not collapse into noise. It remained quiet, grounded, because everyone present understood that what had happened here was not just a moment. It was a turning point, and Ethan stood where he was, not frozen, not uncertain, but steady, watching the space where they had been. And as the doors closed again, sealing the room back into its original light, one truth remained clear. The night had not ended with what was revealed. It had only begun with what would now have to be proven. The doors did not close with noise. They closed with finality, a soft mechanical seal that felt louder than any sound inside the ballroom. And in the moment after they shut, the room did not return to celebration or conversation. It remained suspended, as if everyone was waiting for permission to breathe again. And Ethan stood at the center of that silence, not as its source anymore, but as someone observing it for the first time from within. And for a brief moment he did not move, because movement would have meant returning to the version of himself that controlled rooms like this. But that version no longer fit the space he was standing in, and what remained instead was something quieter, something more exposed. And as he looked around, he saw not admiration, not alignment, but recalibration, people adjusting their understanding of him in real time, no longer defined by success alone, but by what had just been witnessed. And he understood that none of it could be reversed with a sentence, and that understanding settled deeper than discomfort. It settled into responsibility, and he slowly turned away from the doors they had exited through, his gaze lowering for a moment as if anchoring himself. And when he spoke, his voice was no longer addressed to the room as a performance, but as an acknowledgement of what remained. "This does not end here," he said quietly, and the words were not loud, but they carried because they were not meant to impress. And the guests did not respond. They simply listened, because the tone had shifted from spectacle to consequence. And Ethan stepped forward slightly, not toward the center of attention but away from it, as if redefining where he stood within everything that had just changed. And across the room, conversations began to reassemble slowly, not around gossip now, but around interpretation, what had been seen, what had been said, what it meant for the name Ethan Caldwell that had dominated rooms like this for years. And he felt that shift, without needing to hear it directly, because perception in rooms like this always moves faster than words. And yet none of it pulled him back into the posture he had worn earlier in the night, because something had already moved beyond image, and that something was now anchored in the reality he could not ignore. And as he stood there, his attention returned briefly to the empty space where Amara and Lila had been, not as absence, but as direction. And for the first time, he did not interpret that space as loss, but as beginning. And that distinction changed how he breathed, how he stood, how he processed everything that had unfolded. And behind him, a voice from the crowd attempted to break the silence with a question, but it faded before it fully formed, because no one present wanted to return the moment to its previous shape. And Ethan raised a hand slightly, not to silence anyone, but to signal that nothing said in this moment would redefine what had already been acknowledged. And the room understood that without resistance, and the stillness returned, not fragile now, but stable. And Ethan exhaled slowly, his posture steadying in a way that was no longer about control but alignment. And when he finally moved again, it was toward the edge of the ballroom, away from the center where he had once defined every outcome. And each step felt less like retreat and more like adjustment. And as he passed guests who no longer tried to meet his gaze with certainty, he understood that everything he had relied on before this night would now require rebuilding, not publicly, not immediately, but internally. And that realization did not overwhelm him. It clarified him. And when he reached the side corridor where the lighting softened and the sound of the ballroom dulled into distance, he paused, placing one hand lightly against the wall, as if grounding himself in something physical, while everything else reorganized in thought. And in that quieter space, away from the eyes and expectation, the weight of what had happened returned in full, not as chaos, but as structure. The presence of a child who shared his features without needing confirmation, the woman who had carried that truth without seeking validation, and the understanding that neither of them had come here for recognition. They had come because recognition had already been delayed too long, and Ethan lowered his head. Slightly, not in defeat, but in reflection, because for the first time he was not processing how he was perceived, he was processing what was real, and that difference, subtle but absolute, marked the beginning of something he had not expected to face tonight. Not resolution, but accountability. And as he stood there in the quieter edge of the world he had just stepped out of, the noise behind him softened further, becoming distant, almost irrelevant, while what remained in front of him was no longer a room full of witnesses, but a path that would require him to move forward without the certainty he had once mistaken for control. And in that stillness, he finally understood that the night had not taken something from him. It had revealed what had been missing all along, and now there was no way to unsee it. Only a way forward that would demand everything he had not yet learned to give. The corridor outside the ballroom did not feel like an escape. It felt like a transition between two realities that no longer aligned. One built on expectation and control, and the other built on truth that could no longer be contained. And Ethan stood in that quieter space with his hands still lightly resting against the wall, not to steady himself physically, but to steady the shift happening within him. Because for the first time in a long time, he was not thinking in terms of outcomes. He was thinking in terms of responsibility. And that change did not arrive as clarity alone. It arrived as weight, as something that could not be delegated or dismissed. And behind him, the distant sound of the gala continued in muted fragments, laughter that no longer belonged to him, conversations that no longer shaped him. And he realized that the version of his life that existed inside that room was already continuing without him in a different form, one that he could no longer fully enter. And that realization did not create panic. It created focus, because for the first time he understood that presence was not something he could reclaim through authority. It had to be rebuilt through action. And as he straightened, he turned slightly toward the corridor window where the city lights stretched outward in quiet patterns. And he saw in that reflection a version of himself that was no longer defined by certainty, but by recalibration. And it was in that stillness that his phone vibrated once, sharp and immediate, breaking the internal silence he had just begun to accept. And he looked down at the screen, not expecting urgency, but finding it anyway. A message from his assistant containing information that had been delayed until after the event. And as he read it, the words did not feel like surprise. They felt like confirmation, a report confirming legal documentation connected to a 4-year gap in personal records, hospital correspondence, archive filings, and a name that matched what he had already heard in fragments, but had not yet fully processed in structure. And Ethan closed his eyes for a brief moment, not in denial, but in alignment, because now the truth was no longer only emotional. It was documented, and that shift changed everything about how it would need to be approached. And when he opened his eyes again, his expression had settled into something quieter, more deliberate, and he moved away from the wall, walking deeper into the corridor with a steady pace that no longer reflected hesitation. And as he walked, the noise of the gala faded further behind him, replaced by the soft rhythm of his own steps, each one grounding him in a direction that had not existed before tonight. And when he reached a private side room just off the corridor, he paused before entering, taking a moment not to prepare for what was inside, but to ensure that he was no longer reacting from who he had been. And when he finally stepped in, the lighting was lower, the atmosphere stripped of performance, and he closed the door gently behind him, not as an exit from the night, but as a separation from everything that could no longer guide him forward. And he placed the phone on the table, the screen still glowing with unread confirmations, and for a long moment he simply stood there, not moving. Because now the question was no longer what had happened, it was what he would do with what had already been revealed. And that question did not demand urgency, it demanded structure, patience, and something he had not practiced in years, restraint without avoidance. And as he sat down slowly, his gaze fixed on the screen, he did not call anyone, he did not attempt to correct anything, because he understood now that correction without understanding would only repeat the past, and instead he began to think in sequence, not reaction, identifying what had to be acknowledged first, what had to be verified second, and what had to be approached only when clarity replaced assumption. And in that process, something subtle began to change, because for the first time, he was not constructing control, he was constructing responsibility, and outside the room, the world continued without waiting. But inside it, Ethan Caldwell was no longer the center of a moment. He was the beginning of a decision that would require time, truth, and a version of himself that had not yet fully formed. And as he leaned slightly forward, hands clasped together, eyes steady on the faint glow of the screen, he understood that what had entered his life tonight was not a disruption. It was a reckoning that could not be avoided, only responded to. And that response would define everything that came next, not in the room he had left behind, but in every step he chose from this point forward. The room above had long stopped being the center of Ethan Caldwell's world, yet its echo still lingered in his awareness like a fading signal he could not fully disconnect from. And inside the private side room, the lighting was low and steady, designed to remove distraction rather than create comfort, and Ethan remained seated for a long moment without moving, his attention fixed on the faint glow of his phone resting on the table. Because what had arrived on that screen was no longer just information, it was structure, fragments of a reality that had existed outside his awareness but had now entered it with undeniable clarity. And he read it again, slower this time, not because he did not understand it, but because understanding it fully meant accepting its implications. And the message contained confirmations of records, legal documentation, hospital entries, timestamps aligned across years he had previously compartmentalized, and within those details, one constant that tied everything together without ambiguity. And Ethan exhaled slowly, leaning back slightly in the chair, not in disbelief, but in recalibration, because the version of events he had carried until now no longer held complete authority over what was true. And that realization did not destabilize him, it reorganized him, forcing him into a different mode of thought, one that did not rely on perception or assumption, but on verification, sequence, and responsibility. And he placed the phone down carefully, as if the act itself marked the transition from reaction to decision. And for several seconds he did not move, allowing the silence of the room to settle around him in a way that contrasted sharply with the layered noise of the gala outside. And in that silence, he began to reconstruct not the past itself, but his position within it, not as the center, but as a participant whose absence had consequences he had not previously measured. And that distinction carried weight, because it removed the illusion of distance he had once relied on. And as he leaned forward slightly, his hands resting together, he did not think in terms of emotion first. He thought in terms of structure, what had to be acknowledged, what had to be verified independently, what required direct conversation rather than inference. And in that process, something subtle but important shifted within him, because he was no longer trying to control the narrative. He was trying to understand its full scope, and that required a form of patience he had rarely practiced. And as he sat there, the memory of the ballroom re-entered his awareness not as a performance, but as context, the presence of Amara standing, without seeking validation, the quiet certainty in her posture, the way she had not needed to assert truth because truth had already arrived with her. And Lila's steady gaze returned to him in thought, not as a challenge, but as a reflection of something unfiltered, something that did not rely on explanation to exist. And Ethan closed his eyes briefly, not in avoidance, but in concentration, because he understood now that the next step could not be reactionary. It had to be intentional. And when he opened his eyes again, his focus was sharper, less fragmented, and he stood slowly from the chair, moving to the window at the far end of the room, where the city stretched outward in layers of light and distance. And he saw in that view not escape, but scale. The realization that what had occurred tonight was not confined to a single space or audience, but extended beyond it, into systems, histories, and consequences that would require time to navigate properly. And he placed one hand lightly against the glass, not for support, but for grounding. And in that quiet contact, he made a decision that did not need articulation yet, only commitment, that he would not allow this moment to remain fragmented or unresolved. and he would not approach it through shortcuts or assumptions, because anything less would repeat the same gaps that had led here. And behind him, the phone remained on the table, still lit, still waiting. But he did not return to it immediately, because he understood that information alone was not enough. It required presence, and presence required action that could not be delegated. And as he turned away from the window, he began to move again, slowly at first, then with steady intention, not toward resolution, but toward engagement with what had already been set in motion. And in that movement, there was no urgency, only direction. And as he reached the door and paused briefly before opening it, he did not think about returning to the room above, or about reclaiming what had been disrupted. He thought only about what it meant to step forward into a truth that could no longer be avoided. And when he finally opened the door, the sound of the distant Gala reached him again, softened but persistent, and he stepped back into it not as the figure who had once defined it, but as someone entering a reality that now required him to learn how to stand within it differently. And that difference, quiet and irreversible, marked the beginning of a path that could no longer be shaped by control alone, but by understanding, accountability, and the willingness to face what had already been revealed without turning away. When Ethan stepped back into the corridor leading toward the main hall, the atmosphere felt different than it had only minutes before, not because the building itself had changed, but because his perception of it had, and the distance between who he had been at the beginning of the night and who he was now was no longer theoretical. It was tangible, and he felt it in the way he moved, slower, more deliberate, no longer relying on instinct shaped by control, but on awareness shaped by consequence. And as he walked, the distant sound of the Gala returned in fragments, softened by walls and space, but still present enough to remind him that nothing about this moment had ended. It had only transitioned. And when he reached the edge of the main hall, he paused just before entering, not because he was uncertain about presence, but because he understood that stepping back into that space would not mean returning to the position he once held. And that understanding carried a weight he had not anticipated, because for years he had entered rooms like this as the central reference point, and now he was entering as something else entirely. And when he finally stepped through the doorway, the shift was immediate, not in noise or movement, but in perception, because the room did not greet him the same way it had before. Attention was no longer uniformly directed, it was distributed, recalibrated, and he could feel that without anyone saying it directly. And he did not attempt to reclaim it. He simply moved forward into the space that remained open, and across the hall, he saw Amara again, now closer to the exit but not rushing, her presence steady, Lila beside her holding her hand with quiet ease. And there was something about the way they moved together that did not invite interruption, not because it created distance, but because it established completeness. And Ethan observed that without stepping closer immediately, because he was beginning to understand that proximity was no longer the defining factor of connection. And as he approached, slowly, deliberately, Amara turned her head slightly, acknowledging his presence, without pausing her movement entirely, and Lila looked up as well, her expression unchanged from before, still calm, still observant, and Ethan matched their pace rather than interrupting it, walking alongside them rather than ahead or behind. And for a few steps, none of them spoke, because the silence was no longer tension, it was alignment within motion. And when they reached a quieter section near the side exit, Amara stopped first, and Ethan stopped as well, not mirroring but responding. And she looked at him directly, her expression steady but no longer distant. And when she spoke, her voice carried the same clarity it had held throughout the night. "You did not follow for spectacle," she said. And it was not a question, it was a recognition. And Ethan nodded once, because there was no need to construct a response beyond acknowledgement. And he answered simply, "No." And that single word carried more meaning than anything he could have elaborated on, because it confirmed that his presence here was not driven by image or expectation, but by something less defined and more essential. And Lila shifted slightly, glancing between them, then looking up at Ethan again, and he noticed that she no longer observed him with hesitation, only curiosity. And that subtle change mattered more than he expected, because it indicated not acceptance, but neutrality, and neutrality meant possibility. And Amara followed Lila's glance before speaking again, You understand now that this cannot be compressed into a moment, she said, and Ethan responded without hesitation. I understand that it cannot be undone in one. And the distinction between those two statements created a shared understanding that did not rely on agreement, but on recognition of reality, and Amara studied him for a brief moment longer, as if confirming not his words but his direction. And then she shifted her stance slightly, not preparing to leave immediately, but no longer anchored to the conversation. And Ethan noticed that too, the way she existed in transition without urgency, and he realized that this was not a pause in her life. It was a continuation that simply no longer included him as a central variable, and that realization did not provoke resistance within him. It clarified the scope of what he needed to understand, and he spoke again, quieter now. If there is anything I can do that does not interfere with your space, I will do it. And the phrasing was deliberate, because he understood that imposition would undo whatever fragile alignment had formed. And Amara considered the statement without immediate response, not because she doubted it, but because she was evaluating its meaning in practical terms. And when she finally answered, her tone remained steady. Then begin by not assuming proximity equals permission, she said, and Ethan accepted that immediately with a small nod, because it aligned with what he had already begun to understand earlier in the evening. And Lila tugged lightly at Amara's hand, and Amara looked down at her briefly before adjusting her hold. And Ethan observed that interaction without intrusion, and for the first time, he did not interpret it as exclusion, but as structure that existed independently of him. And that distinction shifted something internal again, not dramatically, but definitively. And in that moment, the noise of the gala behind them felt distant enough to no longer define the space they were occupying, and Ethan took a step slightly back, not retreating, but creating deliberate space, and Amara noticed it, though she did not comment. And that silence between them carried more clarity than words could have added. And after a moment, Ethan spoke once more, not to reframe anything, but to anchor his intent. I will not create disruption, he said, and Amara gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, not in approval, but in acknowledgement of coherence. And then she turned slightly toward the exit again, and Lila followed her movement naturally, and Ethan remained where he was, watching them for a brief moment longer, not holding on, not reaching, simply observing the continuation of a path that no longer required his presence to exist. And as they moved toward the exit together, the final separation was not marked by conflict or distance, but by understanding that what had begun inside the gala was no longer contained within it. And Ethan stood in the quiet space they had left behind, not as someone excluded, but as someone recalibrating his position within a reality that no longer revolved around assumption. And in that stillness, he understood that the night had not concluded with resolution. It had concluded with definition, and everything that would follow would depend not on what had been revealed, but on what he chose to become in response to it. The night did not feel like it ended when Amara and Lila stepped out of the building. It felt like it changed shape, as if the space they had occupied inside the gala had redefined everything that followed it. And Ethan remained inside that recalibration even after the doors closed behind them, standing in a silence that was no longer filled with performance or expectation, but with consequence. And for the first time since the beginning of the evening, he was not observing a situation unfold. He was inside its aftermath, and that distinction carried a different kind of weight, not immediate, not loud, but steady and unavoidable. And as the room around him slowly resumed fragments of motion, conversations returning in cautious layers, he did not re-enter them. He did not seek them, because something in him had already moved past the need to be understood in that space. And instead he turned away from the main hall again, walking back through the corridor with a measured pace that reflected not urgency, but direction, and each step felt less like separation from what had happened and more like integration of it, as if the events of the night were no longer external, but internal reference points shaping what came next. And when he reached the quieter area near the side exit once more, he stopped, not because he expected anything to be there, but because the absence itself carried meaning, and he allowed himself to stand in it fully, not resisting it, not filling it, simply acknowledging it. And in that stillness, his thoughts organized themselves not around reaction, but around responsibility, because the presence of Lila, the confirmation of time that could not be reversed, the clarity in Amara's words, none of it allowed for ambiguity anymore. And what remained was not confusion, but structure. And he understood that structure required action that could not be symbolic. And after a long moment, he moved again, this time not toward the ballroom or any public space, but toward the private corridor leading to an exit reserved for guests who left without attention. And as he walked, he made no attempt to reconstruct the evening in terms of emotion alone. He reconstructed it in terms of sequence, what had been revealed, what had been acknowledged, what had been accepted, and what still required response. And by the time he reached the door leading outside, the transition from interior to exterior felt less like leaving an event and more like stepping into continuity. And when he opened it, the cooler air of the city night met him without resistance, and the skyline stretched across the distance in quiet layers of light, indifferent and steady. And Ethan paused just outside, not immediately moving forward, because what he was facing now was not a room or an audience, but time itself, extended beyond a single moment. And he understood that nothing about what had happened inside could be contained there anymore. And that realization did not overwhelm him. It clarified him further. And he stepped forward onto the sidewalk, the sound of distant traffic replacing the controlled silence of the gala. And he began to walk without destination defined by image or expectation, only by thought. And as he moved, he considered not what he had lost, but what had been revealed, because loss was no longer the correct frame. What had occurred was exposure of a continuity he had not been part of, but was now responsible for acknowledging. And somewhere behind him, the building remained lit, filled with people still processing what they had witnessed, but it no longer functioned as a center of gravity for him. And instead, the city around him became the only stable reference. Consistent, unreactive, and as he walked, his phone remained in his hand, no longer vibrating, no longer demanding immediate attention, and yet he did not put it away, because now it represented not interruption, but connection to information that required careful, structured engagement. And he stopped briefly near the edge of the block, looking across the intersection where light reflected off glass and steel. And in that reflection, he saw not the version of himself that had entered the gala, but something quieter, something still forming. And he understood that whatever he chose next would not restore what had been disrupted, but define how he would exist within what had already changed, and that understanding removed urgency, but introduced permanence. And as he continued walking, slower now, more deliberate, he allowed each thought to settle without forcing resolution. Because resolution was no longer immediate, it was cumulative, and it would require consistency over time. And in that realization, something in him stabilized further, not as certainty, but as acceptance of process. And for the first time that night, he was not responding to a moment, he was committing to a path, and that path did not have visibility ahead, only direction. And as the city continued around him in its ordinary rhythm, he moved within it not as someone defined by what had just occurred, but as someone beginning to understand what it meant to continue after it. And in that continuation, there was no conclusion, only the beginning of something that would require time, accountability, and presence beyond anything he had previously known.